The year is 1347. Within the hallowed walls of the Benedictine monastery of St. Michel, Brother Thomas, a man dedicated to the word and the art of illumination, toiled ceaselessly. The world outside, unknown to many of the monks, was a brutal landscape of famine and strife. His world was one of ink and parchment. Day after day, Brother Thomas meticulously transcribed ancient texts, his world limited to the scriptorium's stone walls. He found solace in the rhythm of his work, the steady repetition a form of meditation. Yet, even within this sanctuary, whispers of the outside world occasionally seeped in. One afternoon, while searching for a specific passage in the library, Brother Thomas stumbled upon a forgotten chest. Inside, nestled amongst crumbling parchment and decaying leather, he found an unbound manuscript, its pages filled with outlandish imagery. It was unlike anything he had ever seen within the monastery's collection. The manuscript depicted a land of unimaginable plenty. Rivers of wine flowed through meadows of roast fowl, houses were roofed with cheese, and trees bore fruit year-round. It was a place where laziness was rewarded and labor was unknown, a land called Cockaigne. Brother Thomas stared at the illustrations, his mind struggling to reconcile them with the teachings of the Church, which preached the virtues of poverty and hard work. A wave of unease washed over him. This vision of paradise, of earthly delight without toil, was a stark contrast to the Church's emphasis on suffering as a path to salvation. He quickly shut the book, feeling a sense of guilt for even entertaining such frivolous thoughts. Was this Cockaigne a dangerous temptation, a heretical dream? Meanwhile, miles away at the Château de Montaigne, Lady Alara surveyed her lands. The summer had been merciless, the crops withered and dying under the relentless sun. The faces of her people, once etched with the honest toil of farmers, were gaunt with hunger, disease now rampant in the fields. One evening, a traveling minstrel arrived at the castle, seeking shelter and a meal. He entertained the court with tales of faraway lands and finally a playful tune about Cockaigne, a land of plenty where rivers flowed with wine, and roasted pigs wandered about with knives in their backs, begging to be eaten. Lady Alara listened, a faint smile playing on her lips. For a moment she forgot the troubles of her estate, lost in the allure of this impossible dream. In a small village bordering Lady Alara's lands, Jean the farmer struggled to provide for his family. The famine had hit his village particularly hard, and the once fertile fields were now barren. Every day was a desperate fight for survival. With his children gaunt, his wife sick, he wondered how they would survive. One day, while drawing water from the village well, Jean overheard two other peasants whispering about a legendary land of plenty. Cockaigne, they called it, a land where bread rained from the sky and one need never toil again. Jean listened with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. He had heard such stories before, but this time, the desperation in his heart made him want to believe. Back in the monastery, Brother Thomas found himself drawn back to the forbidden manuscript. He reasoned that understanding the nature of temptation was crucial to resisting it. He began to study the images of Cockaigne with scholarly detachment, attempting to decipher the meaning behind the outlandish imagery. Lady Alara, witnessing the suffering of her people, felt the weight of her responsibilities. She distributed the last of her stores, knowing it was only a temporary solution. The stories of Cockaigne swirled in her mind. It was madness, of course, but the thought of a world without suffering, without hunger, was powerfully seductive. Jean the farmer stood in his barren field, the image of Cockaigne flickering in his mind. The world was bleak and unforgiving, but for the first time a flicker of hope, however faint, ignited within him. Could such a place exist? Was it possible to escape the endless cycle of toil and hardship? The dream of Cockaigne, once a distant whisper, began to take root in the fertile ground of his desperation. Lady Alara surveyed her lands. The rolling hills, usually a tapestry of vibrant greens and golds, were now muted, tinged with the sickly brown of failing crops. The year was 1348, and famine gripped the land with an iron fist. The crops had withered under the relentless sun. Jean the farmer, like many others, faced the agonizing prospect of empty bellies and a bleak winter. His family's survival hung by a thread that seemed to fray with each passing day. Alara, despite her privileged position, was not blind to the suffering around her. The estate's ledger revealed the grim reality, dwindling grain stores and rising debts. She felt a growing unease, a sense of responsibility she couldn't ignore. The rations distributed by Lady Alara offered a temporary respite, but they were woefully inadequate. The desperation in the eyes of her serfs haunted Alara. She knew she had to do more, but her resources were stretched thin. Alara visited the sick, offering what little aid she could provide. The pallor of disease hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the Black Death that stalked the land. She pondered how a benevolent God could permit such suffering. Brother Thomas, oblivious to the immediate hardships outside the monastery walls, continued his work. Yet, even within the cloistered confines, the anxieties of the time seeped in, manifesting in hushed whispers and worried glances. One evening, a traveling merchant sought shelter in Jean's village. Over a meager supper, he spun tales of distant lands, of mountains of cheese and rivers of wine, of a place called Cockaigne, where food grew abundantly and labor was unknown. Alara heard similar whispers from her servants. Tales of Cockaigne, once dismissed as mere folklore, now carried a different weight. The desperation of her people made them susceptible to such fantastical promises. Jean, fueled by the merchant's stories, began to share the tales of Cockaigne with his neighbors. The idea of a land without famine, without toil, took root in their hearts, offering a glimmer of hope in the face of despair. Alara sought the counsel of the village priest. She was troubled by the allure of Cockaigne, concerned that it might distract her people from their faith and their duties. The priest, however, dismissed it as a harmless fantasy, a product of desperation. Even Brother Thomas, insulated as he was, couldn't escape the whispers of Cockaigne. He found himself sketching the mythical land in the margins of his manuscripts, intrigued by the human desire for such a place of unending plenty. As the famine tightened its grip, the dream of Cockaigne offered a temporary solace, a shimmering illusion on the horizon of their suffering. But for Jean the farmer and many others, the reality of the empty fields was a constant, painful reminder of the harshness of their existence. The sun, a merciless taskmaster, beat down upon Jean's back. Each step was a battle against the unyielding earth, each breath a reminder of his aching lungs. He was Jean the farmer, and this relentless struggle was his life. His wife Marie and their 2 children, barely more than skeletons, awaited him. He felt a pang of guilt mixed with despair. What could he offer them? The earth yielded less and less each year. The broth was watery, the vegetables scarce. Marie tried to hide her own hunger, offering the larger portion to the children, but Jean saw the strain in her eyes. Another day closer to starvation. The bailiff, representing their lord, demanded his due. Grain, eggs, a portion of their meager harvest. Jean pleaded, explaining their situation, but the bailiff was unmoved. Debts had to be paid. Returning to his family empty-handed, Jean felt the weight of his failure crush him. He had nothing left to offer, nothing to protect them from the gnawing hunger. One evening, a traveling merchant arrived in the village, seeking shelter for the night. As the villagers gathered around the fire, he spun tales of distant lands, of mountains of cheese and rivers of wine. Jean listened, captivated. The merchant spoke of Cockaigne, a land where roasted geese flew directly into one's mouth, where houses were thatched with cakes, and where rivers flowed with wine. A land where no one toiled and food was plentiful. That night Jean recounted the merchant's tale to Marie. She scoffed, calling it a fool's dream, yet Jean saw a flicker of longing in her weary eyes. The idea, however fantastical, had taken root. In the days that followed, Jean's mind was consumed by thoughts of Cockaigne. The backbreaking labor in the fields seemed even more unbearable compared to the imagined ease of that mythical land. He began to share the stories with other villagers, men and women worn down by hardship. Some dismissed it as idle fancy, but others listened with rapt attention, their eyes reflecting a shared yearning for escape. Jean stood at the edge of his field, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and red. The land offered him nothing but toil and sorrow. Cockaigne, a shimmering mirage, beckoned in the distance. Despair gnawed at him. He knelt, clutching a handful of dry earth. Was there really a place where such suffering didn't exist? Or was Cockaigne simply a cruel trick, a phantom designed to torment those who dared to dream of something more? Within the monastery, Brother Thomas encountered Cockaigne not in whispered tales, but in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. A grotesque parody, a land of plenty where roasted pigs wandered with knives sticking from their backs, ready to be carved. For Jean, the allure arrived on the wind, carried by traveling minstrels. Their songs, bawdy and fantastical, spoke of Cockaigne, a place where rivers flowed with wine and cheese rained from the heavens. He clung to these verses like a drowning man to driftwood. Lady Alara encountered Cockaigne through courtly poems and plays, where it was portrayed as a land of leisure and inverted social order, a temporary release from the rigid constraints of feudal society. But she also saw the danger of it being an affront to God's order. The Church, of course, saw Cockaigne as a dangerous heresy. Moralizing tracts decried it as a celebration of gluttony and sloth, a direct affront to God's will and the virtues of hard work and piety. But Brother Thomas saw something else, a symptom. The dream took physical form in village festivals and crude puppet shows. Jean and his neighbors, for a fleeting moment, could enact their desires, mocking the lords and celebrating abundance, even if only in jest. Traveling players brought the inverted world of Cockaigne to life within castle walls. Lady Alara watched as nobles and commoners alike laughed at the spectacle of peasants feasting while lords toiled, a temporary suspension of the natural order. Brother Thomas noticed the subtle shifts in the iconography of Cockaigne. Early depictions focused on food. Later ones emphasized leisure and sexual freedom, a growing resentment of societal constraints manifesting in art. Interpretations varied wildly. For some, Cockaigne was a literal place, a tangible escape. For others, like Jean, it was a symbol, a reminder that a different life was possible, a seed of hope planted in the barren soil of their existence. Lady Alara recognized the destabilizing potential. If the peasants truly believed in a world without labor or hierarchy, what would stop them from challenging the very foundations of their society? Thomas understood the paradox. Cockaigne was a dangerous illusion, but it was born of genuine hunger, not just for food, but for dignity, for respite, for a world where the burdens were more evenly distributed. For Jean, the songs of Cockaigne grew fainter with each passing year, each failed harvest, each death from the plague. The dream became a cruel taunt, a reminder of what he could never have. Lady Alara knew that the true challenge was not to suppress the dream of Cockaigne, but to address the conditions that gave rise to it. Charity, though, was but a band-aid on a festering wound. Brother Thomas found himself increasingly distracted. The images of Cockaigne, once a curiosity, now gnawed at the edges of his faith. The contrast between the manuscript's whimsical abundance and the stark reality of the world outside the monastery walls created a dissonance he could no longer ignore. Seeking answers, Thomas turned to the vast library of St. Mitchell. He sought solace and justification within the works of Augustine, Aquinas, and other theological giants, hoping to reconcile the promise of heavenly reward with the undeniable suffering of earthly existence. He immersed himself in Aquinas' teachings on poverty and wealth, carefully transcribing passages that spoke of the necessity of suffering for spiritual growth. Yet, the explanations felt hollow, insufficient to quell the rising tide of doubt within him. He wrestled with the concept of divine justice. Was it truly God's will that so many should starve while others lived in opulence? Was Cockaigne, in its grotesque exaggeration, a reflection of a deeper societal imbalance that the Church chose to ignore? During evening prayers, Thomas observed Abbot Michael, a man known for his unwavering faith and his pronouncements against worldly pleasures. He wondered if the abbot truly believed in the virtue of poverty, or if it was simply a convenient tool for maintaining order and control. The shared meals, once a source of communal comfort, now felt like a stark reminder of the world's inequalities. The plain bread and watery broth seemed a meager offering compared to the bounty depicted in the Cockaigne manuscripts. He revisited familiar biblical passages, seeking new interpretations. The parable of Lazarus and the rich man, with its promise of reversed fortunes in the afterlife, offered a temporary solace, but failed to fully address the systemic injustices of the present. He sought counsel from Brother Benedict, an elder monk known for his wisdom and quiet contemplation. He cautiously voiced his doubts, framing them as theological questions rather than outright challenges to church doctrine. Brother Benedict listened patiently, his eyes filled with understanding. He reminded Thomas that faith was not the absence of doubt, but the courage to grapple with it. He encouraged Thomas to continue his search for truth, even if it led him to uncomfortable conclusions. Returning to his work, Thomas found himself unable to ignore the implications of Cockaigne. It was more than just a fantasy. It was a symptom of a deeper societal malaise, a yearning for justice and abundance that resonated with the suffering he witnessed every day. He began to subtly alter the illumination, adding details that hinted at the inequalities of the world outside. A starving peasant lurking at the edge of the feasting scene, a church official turning a blind eye to the suffering of the poor. His small acts of defiance, acts of rebellion, masked as simple details. As he looked out the window, Thomas knew his journey had just begun. He had not abandoned his faith, but he could no longer accept the Church's simplistic explanations for the world's suffering. The illusion of Cockaigne, once a source of amusement, had become a catalyst for profound and unsettling questions about the divine plan. Lady Alara surveyed the long line of gaunt faces, each one a testament to the relentless famine that gripped the land. Her heart ached with a sorrow she felt powerless to truly alleviate. Today's distribution of grain, though substantial for her coffers, would only stave off starvation for a few days. Jean shuffled forward, his stomach gnawing with hunger. The small amount of grain he would receive would barely feed his family for a week. He wondered how much longer they could endure this constant struggle for survival. Tales of Cockaigne, with its rivers of wine and mountains of cheese, seemed a cruel mockery, yet he couldn't entirely dismiss the hope they offered. "We must do more, Thomas," Lady Alara insisted, her voice laced with urgency. "The people are starving. This charity is but a drop in the ocean." The steward, Thomas, sighed. "My lady, the stores are dwindling. We must consider our own survival. And with all due respect, lavish handouts risk encouraging idleness." Jean returned to his family, the meager sack of grain feeling like a lead weight in his hands. His wife Marie and their 2 children looked at him with hollow eyes. He knew the relief on their faces would be short-lived. The thought of Cockaigne, a land where such suffering didn't exist, flickered once more in his mind. That night, Lady Alara knelt in the chapel, seeking solace in prayer. She questioned the fairness of a world where some were born into privilege while others were condemned to a life of unrelenting hardship. The teachings of the Church emphasized acceptance of one's station, but her own conscience cried out against such complacency. As the family ate their meager portion of porridge, their neighbor, a grizzled old man named Pierre, regaled them with stories of Cockaigne. Jean listened, a mixture of skepticism and longing in his heart. The descriptions of roasted geese flying directly into one's mouth, of rivers flowing with wine, painted a vivid picture of an impossible paradise. Lady Alara, unable to sleep, pored over the estate's account books. She saw the stark reality of their situation: dwindling resources, increasing debts, and the crushing weight of taxes owed to the crown. She realized that even her considerable wealth was insufficient to address the systemic problems that plagued her people. The next morning, Jean surveyed his parched fields. The crops were failing, withered and lifeless under the relentless sun. He felt a growing sense of hopelessness, a feeling that no amount of labor could overcome the forces arrayed against him. The lure of Cockaigne, with its promise of effortless abundance, became increasingly seductive. Lady Alara rode through the village, witnessing the suffering firsthand. She saw the gaunt faces of children, the despair in the eyes of the men, the exhaustion etched on the faces of the women. She began to question the very foundations of the feudal system, the rigid hierarchy that seemed to condemn so many to a life of misery. In the village square, Jean overheard hushed conversations. A group of peasants, driven to desperation, were planning to leave, to venture into the unknown in search of Cockaigne. The idea was reckless, foolish even, but Jean couldn't deny the spark of hope that ignited within him. Lady Alara consulted with a visiting scholar, seeking answers to the problems that plagued her lands. He spoke of new farming techniques, of crop rotation and soil management, but she knew that such solutions were long-term, and her people needed help now. She began to see the need for a more fundamental change, a shift in the very structure of society. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jean stood at the edge of the village, ready to embark on his desperate quest. He knew the risks were great, that Cockaigne might be nothing more than a fool's dream, but he could no longer bear to watch his family starve. He would gamble everything on the illusion of plenty, for it was the only hope he had left. The relentless sun beat down on Jean's field, mirroring the harsh reality of his existence. But today, a new thought, a dangerous seed of hope, had taken root in his weary mind. Cockaigne, the land where labor ceased and sustenance flowed freely. Could it be real? Could it be his escape? Around the table, his family ate their meager portion of stale bread with quiet resignation. Jean watched them, his heart heavy. Was this all there was? Endless toil, constant hunger, and the ever-present threat of death. He began to calculate in his mind how far could he travel, what provisions could he gather. He sought out his neighbors, listening to their tales and complaints. He heard whispers of others who had vanished, lured away by the same promise of ease. Some said they found it, others that they died on the road, and some that the whole thing was just a lie. But Jean did not know what to think, what was true and what was false. He stood before his small plot of land, the only legacy he could leave his children. Abandoning it felt like a betrayal, a failure. But the thought of watching his family starve another winter was a far greater horror. He broached the idea with his wife, Marie. Her face, etched with years of hardship, registered a familiar mix of worry and resignation. She understood his desperation, but the risks were terrifying. The decision was made. He gathered what little provisions they had: a small sack of grain, a worn blanket, a knife. Every item felt heavy with the weight of his hopes and fears. Saying goodbye to his children was the hardest part. He hugged them tightly, whispering promises of a better future. He knew he might never see them again. He walked away from the village, his back to the only home he'd ever known. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but the yearning for Cockaigne, the promise of plenty, pushed him forward. Soon he reached a crossroads. The signs were faded, illegible. He had no map, no guide, only the whispered directions of others, unreliable at best. Which way to Cockaigne? He encountered a group of merchants, their faces hardened by the road. He asked them for directions, but they eyed him with suspicion. A lone peasant, heading where? They gave him vague answers and moved on quickly, wary of thieves and beggars. Days turned into weeks. Hunger gnawed at his belly and exhaustion pulled at his limbs. His meager provisions dwindled. Doubts crept in, whispering insidious questions in his ear. Was Cockaigne just a foolish dream? Yet as despair threatened to consume him, a glimmer caught his eye on the horizon. A distant shimmer, like a promise whispered on the wind. Could it be? Was Cockaigne against all odds within reach? Or was it just another cruel trick of the light, another phantom in the peasant's dream? The whispers had reached even the highest echelons of the church. Tales of Cockaigne, once dismissed as peasant folly, were now perceived as a threat to the established order. The church, fearing the erosion of its authority, began to actively denounce the myth of Cockaigne. It was framed as a dangerous distraction from piety and hard labor, a path to eternal damnation. From village pulpits, priests thundered against the seductive allure of Cockaigne, warning their congregations of the spiritual dangers of seeking earthly paradise. The core message was clear. Earthly suffering was a test of faith, a necessary trial on the path to divine reward. Cockaigne, with its promise of effortless abundance, undermined this fundamental tenet. For the nobility, the church's condemnation served to reinforce the existing social hierarchy. The myth of Cockaigne threatened the delicate balance of power, promising equality where there was none. The church stressed the importance of accepting one's divinely ordained place in society. Discontent and yearning for a better life were portrayed as sinful rebellions against God's will. The church feared that the allure of Cockaigne would lead to moral decay, encouraging gluttony, laziness, and a general disregard for religious duties. The promise of readily available food in Cockaigne challenged the existing system of resource distribution, threatening the power and wealth of the landowning class. The preachers warned that those who sought Cockaigne were abandoning their families, neglecting their duties, and ultimately jeopardizing their souls. Yet, despite the church's efforts, the idea of Cockaigne persisted, a stubborn ember of hope refusing to be extinguished. The stark contrast between the church's condemnation of earthly desires and the desperate needs of the people fueled a growing sense of unease and questioning among some, even those in positions of power. For Jean and countless others, the dream of Cockaigne, though condemned, remained a potent symbol of a world free from hunger, labor, and despair. A world they desperately yearned for, despite the church's warnings. The year of our Lord 1348 descended like a shroud. The whispers of a pestilence sweeping across the continent had finally reached the monastery walls. It was no longer a distant threat, but a horrifying reality. The Black Death recognized no social boundaries. It ravaged the peasant's hut and the lord's castle with equal fervor. Ilara watched as her people succumbed, their bodies ravaged by the unseen enemy. Prayers seemed futile against its relentless advance. For Jean, the dream of Cockaigne evaporated like morning mist. Survival became the sole focus. Each day was a struggle to bury the dead, tend to the sick, and pray for deliverance that never seemed to arrive. The monastery, once a refuge of spiritual solace, became a quarantine. Brother Thomas witnessed the slow, agonizing deaths of his brothers, their bodies covered in buboes, their faces contorted in pain. His faith was tested as never before. Ilara, stripped of her illusions of control, did what she could. She emptied her granaries, tending to the sick and orphaned, but it felt like a futile attempt to stem a raging tide. The utopian dream of Cockaigne was a cruel jest in the face of such devastation. The Black Death had stolen everything from Jean, his family, his neighbors, his livelihood, and his hope. The promise of a land of plenty now seemed like a cruel taunt, a reminder of all that he had lost. The deaths continued, unabated. Thomas questioned the very foundations of his faith. Where was God in this suffering? Was earthly reward only a cruel myth meant to distract the living from their misery? The social order began to crumble. With so many dead, fields lay untended, villages were abandoned. The very fabric of society was unraveling, the illusion of stability shattered by the relentless march of death. The allure of Cockaigne, with its promise of effortless abundance, now felt like a mocking mirage. Jean understood that true sustenance came not from fantastical lands, but from the sweat of one's brow and the strength of community, both of which had been decimated by the plague. Thomas returned to his work, but the images of Cockaigne held no comfort. He now saw them for what they were, a desperate attempt to escape a harsh reality, a dangerous distraction from the true challenges facing humanity. Ilara, faced with the stark reality of loss, resolved to rebuild. She understood that true hope lay not in escaping the world, but in confronting its challenges with courage, resilience, and compassion. The Black Death left a scar on the land and on the souls of its people. The dream of Cockaigne faded, replaced by the grim reality of survival. But even in the face of such devastation, the seeds of hope remained, waiting to be sown in the fertile ground of human resilience. The pestilence had passed, leaving a silence deeper than any he had known before. Brother Thomas found himself revisiting the images of Cockaigne, not with longing, but with a sense of profound understanding. The land of plenty was not a physical place, but a reflection of the deepest human desires, a yearning for respite from suffering that echoed in the hollow chambers of his heart. The fields of Montaigne bore the scars of the plague and the famine, yet, Lady Alara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The dream of Cockaigne, once a tempting escape, now served as a reminder of her responsibilities. It was her duty to rebuild, to care for her people, and to create a more just world, however imperfect. Jean returned to the land, his back still aching, his hands still calloused. The tales of Cockaigne had faded, replaced by the stark reality of survival, but something had changed within him. The dream of effortless abundance had given way to a quiet strength, a determination to nurture the soil and provide for his family, even in the face of adversity. The images of Cockaigne persisted, not as a literal destination, but as a symbolic representation of hope. Brother Thomas, in his illuminations, began to subtly weave elements of this dream into his work, a silent testament to the enduring human desire for a better world. Lady Alara, remembering the empty bellies and the desperate pleas, implemented new policies on her lands. She distributed grain fairly, invested in new farming techniques, and provided aid to those who were struggling. She understood that the true Cockaigne was not a mythical land, but a society where everyone had enough to thrive. Jean, having learned the value of community, shared his harvest with his neighbors, understanding that collective effort was the only true path to survival. The dream of Cockaigne had been replaced by the reality of shared hardship and mutual support. Brother Thomas began to write, not about the literal land of Cockaigne, but about the underlying human desires it represented. He spoke of justice, equality, and the importance of caring for the poor and vulnerable. His words, subtly interwoven with the imagery of the mythical land, resonated with his fellow monks. Lady Alara transformed her governance, prioritizing the needs of her people and ensuring their voices were heard. She became a champion of social justice, a beacon of hope in a world still plagued by inequality and suffering. The dream of Cockaigne had inspired her to create a more equitable reality. Jean, once consumed by his own struggles, became a mentor to the younger generation, sharing his knowledge and skills. He understood that the true wealth lay not in effortless abundance, but in the wisdom and resilience of the community. The myth of Cockaigne evolved. Minstrels sang new songs, poets wrote new verses, and artists created new images. The focus shifted from individual indulgence to collective well-being. Cockaigne became a symbol of a just and equitable society, a reminder of the potential for a better world. Brother Thomas understood that Cockaigne was not a place to be found, but a dream to be pursued. It was a constant reminder that the world could be better, that suffering was not inevitable, and that even in the darkest of times, hope could endure. Lady Alara, standing on the ramparts of her castle, surveyed her lands. The fields were green, the people were healthy, and the community was thriving. The illusion of Cockaigne had faded, but its legacy lived on, in the enduring pursuit of a more just and equitable world.